In this video, we're going to talk about a concept called scope of declaration. And it helps us to think about where we are declaring variables so that we can use them where we're going to need them at a later time. So you've learned to create various structures, if blocks, methods, classes, constructors, all these things that go inside of various items. And so it's important to think about where we're putting our variables as well. So when we're thinking about variable scope, if I declare a variable here in my class, just right after the curly brace, not in a method, not in a constructor, like we declared these variables here, these variables have scope to the entire class. So any item inside of the class, whether it's a method or property or whatever, can have access to this particular item because it's at the highest level of scope for this object. Whereas a variable declared inside of a method header or declared inside of a method itself, so if I came in here and declared another value, then the scope of this variable is only going to exist within the block that it was created. So in this case, I won't be able to use another number inside of create report because it's declared inside of this block. Therefore, it doesn't exist outside of the report count method. So we have to think about where we're declaring our variables, especially as we start to create if blocks and our public properties and our classes, so that we have access to the variables where we need them and we can reference back to them when we need that information or we need to change that information. So just to reiterate, the scope of any declared item or a parameter declaration, like in this case with our constructor, is only the body of the method in which the declaration appears. The scope of a local variable declaration is only going to reside from the point in which it's declared down. So for example, if I move this variable all the way to the end of the class document, that would give me scope problems because places where I'm using it, it's not yet declared. So we need to make sure that we're declaring them in the right place in our files so that we're not ending up with errors. The scope of a local variable declaration that appears in the initialization section, and you'll see this when we get into for statements or other expressions that require declarations in the header, these only reside within the curly brace block that they're given. So similar to a method, they're only available in scope for the method block. So the scope of a method itself, so like down here where we created our methods, report type, create report, or the scope of our properties inside of our class, is the entire body of the class. As long as we have everything inside the class, it doesn't matter if it's set to private, as private gives us access to everything in the whole class. It only runs into private versus public when we want to access things over in the main. So keeping scope of declarations in the front of your mind when you're creating variables or you're looking at errors in Visual Studio and trying to diagnose problems in code, any block can contain variable declarations, but if you're not declaring things in the right place or in the right order, you could end up with an error and maybe be confused about how to fix that. We also need to be careful about local variables or methods that have the same name, as this is legal, as we've seen here, private string name and string name, right, look like the same variable, but ultimately are different. Where private string name has scope to the entire class, it gets overridden just in the constructor block by string name in the parameter list. So it may seem a little confusing at first, and you may want to just stick to not naming things the same if you're having a hard time wrapping your head around it, but that is the basic idea behind scope of declarations.